All right, we've got some breaking news. The DHS Secretary Kristi Noem is speaking at the White House. She's addressing President Trump's threat to use the Insurrection Act in Minnesota. Let's take a listen.
I describe it as violent and a violation of the law in many places. I discussed with the president this morning several things that we are dealing with under the department in different operations. We did discuss the Insurrection Act. He certainly has the constitutional authority to utilize that. My hope is that this leadership team in Minnesota will start to work with us to get criminals off the streets. Remember, we are there in surged operations because of the largest fraud scheme in American history. We had people stealing from taxpayers, stealing funds away from the most vulnerable individuals in this country, people who needed mental health services, developmental services, autism, daycare. Instead, individuals came in, much from the Somalian community, and stole dollars from those people who needed it and put it in their own pockets and enriched themselves. Did it right under Governor Walz's nose, and we believe that he didn't just know about it, that he may be complicit in it as well.
Madam Secretary?
Thank you, Secretary. Do you believe there are any cases in Minnesota where the ICE agents have gone too far?
Our ICE agents are following the law and running their operations according to training. Last night what we saw was 3 individuals weaponize shovels and brooms and attack an ICE officer that had to defend himself. So we're hopeful that we don't see that again, that these protesters and violent rioters will be held accountable for the actions that they're taking, and that our officers can do their work safely.
Madam Secretary? Madam Secretary?
Can you give us an update on that ICE officer's mission after he was the shovel?
You know, he was
We're seeing those cars looted in Minnesota. Can you provide an update on what the agency is going to do about that, and concerned with the documents that were taken by those?
Well, I believe that those vehicles were FBI vehicles, not our Department of Homeland Security vehicles. So I'm not certain what documents were in there that those criminals may have taken and seen. But I would say that our agent is beat up, he's bruised, he's injured, he's getting treatment, and we're thankful that he made it out alive.
Madam Secretary? Madam Secretary?
Secretary Noem, are you okay with federal agents and officers violating people's Fourth Amendment rights by asking for papers without reasonable suspicion?
Every single action that our ICE officers take is according to the law and following protocols that we have used for years, that this administration has used, that the previous administration used. They are doing everything correctly, and over again in litigation in the courts, we've proven that they've done the right thing.
Why is it within
Madam Secretary?
Madam Secretary? Their right to ask for papers without reasonable
the Insurrection
suspicion?
Act with the president. But you said you discussed the Insurrection Act with the president. Did you recommend that?
No, we just discussed it, that it was one of the options that he had constitutionally, and we talked about the fact that we're going to continue our operations in Minneapolis and have the resources that we need to get the job done.
Madam Secretary? Madam Secretary?
All right, so there you have the DHS Secretary Kristi Noem taking questions from reporters. A lot of things that she's saying. Let's bring in CBS News contributor Jessica Levinson to just break down some of what we just heard from Kristi Noem. Look, at one point she says that the governor of the state of Minnesota, Tim Walz, may have been complicit in that bribery and embezzlement scheme that was happening in Minneapolis. There's no proof of that.
Evidence.
We haven't seen any proof of that. But Jessica, let's talk about what she is suggesting here, which is that the president has the ability to use the Insurrection Act because of this ongoing, I guess, situation in Minneapolis. What do you make of that argument?
So what I make of that is that using the Insurrection Act is quite serious. It's extraordinary. It means that the military is on the ground in U.S. cities directly enforcing domestic law. The Insurrection Act presents an exception to the Posse Comitatus Act. Vlad, you and I talked about that a lot when the president federalized the National Guard, because we said the National Guard can only serve as basically backup in the sense that they can't be the ones directly carrying out civilian law. The Insurrection Act, again, is an exception to that. So what do we see? We see an act from 1807 that gives the president extraordinary power. The first part of the act says, a governor asks you. Obviously, that's not where we are right now. The second part of the act says that there's some sort of unrest or rebellion where federal officers cannot carry out federal law through regular judicial proceedings, meaning there's been such a breakdown that local law enforcement is almost undermining what federal officers can do, and federal officers can't carry out their jobs. The last section, and that's the one that was used during the civil rights era, talks about a situation where people's individual rights, their individual constitutional rights, like their right to equal protection, is being undermined. That's why you saw it during the civil rights era to carry out desegregation orders. But the bottom line is we're talking about the second two parts of the act. It provides the president with extraordinary power. And frankly, we don't have a lot of precedent to indicate that there are significant checks either from Congress or the judicial branch to second guess the president on his decision that, yes, we do need the Insurrection Act.
And we don't have a lot of details about what the justification is other than what Kristi Noem just said, which is that they're looking at the largest fraud scheme in American history. That's what they're saying they're going to need to invoke this for. Is that a just legal argument, Jessica?
So I'm going to kind of tackle that by saying one of the interesting questions about the Insurrection Act is when you get to second guess a president and when you get to say that's just, that's not just. We have a recent opinion by a district court judge, Judge Breyer. He dealt with a similar case out of Los Angeles, where I'm talking to you from now. And he said basically the Insurrection Act isn't a blank check. He indicated that, in fact, it would be okay for judges to look to see, are the triggering facts for the Insurrection Act present? But I think this is one of the big questions, which is at what point, because the Trump administration has argued that these types of decisions are political questions, that they're not reviewable by federal judges. And so I think the big question is, can a judge say, you know what, no, the facts aren't there? That's not enough to trigger this extraordinary power.
So, Jessica, the other thing that I thought was interesting, which is what Kristi Noem was saying to reporters there when she was asked a question regarding having to show proof of citizenship. Chanel is a Canadian, and so we were just talking about that as we listened to the DHS Secretary respond to that question. As far as I can tell, the United States has never enacted any kind of general federal law that would legally require a U.S. citizen to carry proof of citizenship at all times. There have been, as you know, some specific ID requirements for certain activities in very narrow cases, but all of this is not universal carry proof of citizenship, and there's no federal law that requires that. And it seems almost un-American for a federal an official, a cabinet member, to suggest that Americans in their homeland, when you're not crossing the border, or in maybe one of these specific narrow cases that have been perhaps decided before, would have to carry citizenship papers.
I want to be careful because I didn't hear that specific exchange, and I didn't hear if she alluded to any of the, as you said, specific instances where someone would have to show, yes, I am a U.S. citizen. But my understanding is the same as yours, Vlad, which is that's not what the law requires at this point, and that would be a change in our behavior.
Yeah, she said U.S. citizens should be prepared to show proof, Jessica.
Again, that's not how we've operated up until this point. Certainly, I think we've all had situations where we've had to show proof of citizenship in order to do specific things, in order to get a passport, in order to, fill in the blank, get a certain government document. Most of us are not accustomed to a situation where we're walking around with our citizenship papers in the normal course.
And you can point out, Jessica, we should point out that even in the legal debates that have existed around requiring proof of citizenship to vote, voter registration and citizenship proof, there have been attempts in the past to impose federal documentary proof of citizenship in this country, and that hasn't been able to get any traction at all.
So there's, as you know, robust discussion both on the state level, on the federal level, about whether or not voter ID laws are permissible. There's a case from the Supreme Court dating back longer ago, I think, than I realized at this point, because I feel like I taught it recently, the Crawford case, dealing with voter ID requirements and essentially when they're permissible, because you want to have a situation where, of course, you're protecting against fraud, where you are ensuring that the people who say they're voting are actually who they are. But you also want a situation where you're not undermining people's right to vote, where you're not infringing on just certain ability, people who have more trouble than other people getting government documents, people for whom paying $10 to get the right type of ID presents a barrier. You don't want to infringe on their right to vote as well.
I just think this discussion about having to be prepared to show proof is so inherently different feeling than showing proof to vote. just existing in America and having to worry about that I think is going to hit differently for people. But we'll have to leave it there for now. Jessica Levinson, thank you for helping us break this down.